Imagine falling. Not from a ladder, not from a cliff, from the edge of existence itself. You are dropping toward Earth at nearly 25,000 miles per hour, faster than any bullet ever fired, faster than sound by so many times that sound has given up trying to keep pace. Around you, the air turns into fire. Not metaphorically, not poetically, chemically, physically. The molecules of nitrogen and oxygen that have been peacefully coexisting with you for 10 days suddenly compress against the front of your spacecraft with such violent force that they split apart, recombine, and ignite into a plasma sheath hot enough to melt the engine of a commercial jet. You cannot see outside because the windows have turned into liquid sun. You cannot speak to anyone on Earth because the fire around you is so electrically charged that it swallows radio waves like a black hole swallows light. And between you and that fire, between you and a death that would take less than a single heartbeat, stands a material called Avcoat, a material that NASA already knows is broken, not cracked in theory, not flawed on paper, broken in practice, broken on the only flight it ever took, broken with chunks missing from its surface with gashes over 100 locations deep enough to make engineers go quiet when they first saw them. And yet, 4 human beings are strapped on top of it, 3 Americans, 1 Canadian, a commander who has already buried his wife, a pilot making history, a woman who has spent more consecutive days in space than any other human, and a fighter pilot from the North who is about to become the first non-American to leave Earth behind. Their capsule has a name. They call it Integrity. This is the story of 6 minutes that almost broke NASA, of a heat shield that almost failed, and of the longest, loneliest fall in the history of human spaceflight. To understand why those 6 minutes above the Pacific Ocean were the most dangerous moments any astronaut has faced in decades, you have to rewind 3.5 years. December 2022. The Artemis 1 mission. No crew, just a test flight. Orion, the same spacecraft design that would later carry humans, loops around the moon, takes postcard-perfect photographs of the lunar surface, and turns for home. From the outside, the re-entry looks textbook. The capsule splashes down off the coast of Baja California. Recovery teams fish it out of the water. Mission Control in Houston exhales for the first time in days. Then they flip the capsule over, and the room goes silent. The heat shield, a 16.5-foot disc of Avcoat material designed to burn away in a controlled, predictable fashion, looks like it has been attacked with a chisel. Instead of eroding smoothly, layer by layer, like a candle melting from the outside in, the shield has fractured. Cracked, popped. Pieces of it are missing, not tiny chips. Fragments large enough that NASA's own Office of the Inspector General will later describe a trail of debris behind the spacecraft. Over 100 locations where the material has simply given up. Here is what was supposed to happen. Ablative heat shields work by sacrificing themselves. They absorb the insane energy of re-entry by burning away, carrying that heat off into the wake of the spacecraft. It is a controlled suicide. Predictable, mathematical, safe. Here is what actually happened. The Avcoat didn't burn, it shattered. For nearly 2 years, NASA's best engineers tear apart the mystery. They run over 100 tests at facilities scattered across the country, arc jets at the Ames Research Center in California, hypersonic wind tunnels in Virginia, laser imaging at Marshall Space Flight Center in Alabama, 200 samples pulled from the damaged shield, each one dissected, scanned, and simulated to death. The root cause, when it finally emerges in December 2024, is almost absurd in its subtlety. The Avcoat wasn't porous enough. Here's why that matters. During re-entry, the heat shield doesn't just burn. It undergoes a process called pyrolysis. Without oxygen, the material begins to decompose, releasing gas from deep inside its structure. On a properly designed shield, on Apollo's heat shield, on every successful Mars lander, on the capsules that brought humans home for half a century, those gases seep outward through the charred outer layer. They vent harmlessly into the atmosphere. The shield breathes. On Artemis 1, the gases couldn't get out. The outer char layer had sealed itself too tightly. Pressure built, cracks formed, and when Orion dipped back into the atmosphere for the second phase of its skip re-entry, a maneuver designed to reduce G-forces by bouncing off the atmosphere like a stone skipping on water, those pressurized pockets detonated outward, like blisters bursting on sunburned skin, except the blisters were made of spacecraft. and the skin was all that stood between a multi-million-dollar capsule and incineration. Here is the part that haunts NASA's history books. Apollo engineers knew about this problem. 50 years earlier, they had formulated the original AVCoat with exactly the right permeability. Apollo capsules used skip re-entry trajectories. Apollo capsules never had heat shield issues, but the Artemis version of AVCoat was reformulated. Slightly. Tiny changes in manufacturing, in density, in the way the material was applied to the titanium skeleton of the heat shield. Nobody caught that those changes had stolen the shield's ability to breathe, until pieces of it were floating in the Pacific. By the time the Artemis 1 capsule is hauled out of the ocean and engineers start cutting into its shield, the Artemis 2 spacecraft is already built. The heat shield is already bolted onto Orion's hull. It is less permeable than the one that just failed, because NASA had deliberately made it denser to test bonding strength. Replacing it would mean unstacking the entire rocket, disassembling the capsule, years of delay to a program already running half a decade behind schedule. So NASA makes a decision that will be debated in engineering ethics classes for generations. They decide to fly it anyway, but not blindly. The engineers realize something critical. The damage on Artemis 1 wasn't random. It was triggered by the skip re-entry profile, the bounce maneuver that lets the capsule cool off between atmospheric dips. During that bounce, the outer char layer cools and seals while the inner layers stay scorching hot. That temperature difference traps the gas if they change the trajectory, if they skip the skip. If they come in on a steeper, more direct path that keeps the heat shield under continuous high temperature from start to finish, then the outer layer never gets a chance to seal. The gases vent continuously. The shield breathes. It becomes a bet, a massive high-stakes wager with 4 human lives in the pot. Change the angle of attack, keep the fire constant, and pray that the math holds. Former astronaut Charles Camarda is not praying. Camarda is a heat shield expert. He flew on the first shuttle mission after the Columbia disaster. He has spent decades thinking about thermal protection systems, about the ways they fail, about the institutional blind spots that get astronauts killed. When he hears NASA's plan, he goes public. He estimates the probability of catastrophic failure at 1 in 20. Let that number sit with you for a moment. A 95% chance of success. That sounds reassuring. That sounds like good odds. Until you remember that NASA's own safety threshold for crew loss during re-entry is supposed to be roughly 1 in 500. Camarda is not just criticizing the shield, he is criticizing the culture. He says NASA has not fully modeled how cracks could propagate under the modified trajectory. He says the analytical tools are incomplete. He says the decision to fly is being driven by schedule pressure, not engineering certainty. And then he invokes a name that nobody in Houston wants to hear: Columbia. February 1st, 2003. The Space Shuttle Columbia breaks apart over Texas. 7 astronauts die because a piece of foam insulation struck the wing during launch and because management decided not to investigate. The foam had struck before, on previous flights. Nothing bad had happened, so nothing bad would happen this time. That logic, the logic of "it worked before, so it will work again," killed 7 people. 23 years later, NASA is asking the Artemis 2 crew to trust a heat shield that failed on its only previous flight. The parallels are so uncomfortable that Camarda invokes Columbia by name. He is not being dramatic. He is being precise. He is saying, "You are making the same mistake." NASA pushes back. Engineers run worst-case simulations where entire blocks of AVCoat are stripped away during descent. They find that Orion's underlying composite structure, reinforced with titanium ribs, can survive even that nightmare scenario. An independent review team examines all the data. They agree with NASA's conclusions. Commander Reed Wiseman, the man whose life depends on the shield, sits through the engineering meetings. He walks through the data himself. He tells reporters, "If we stick to the new re-entry path, then this heat shield will be safe to fly." He says it calmly, confidently, like a man who has made peace with the math. But peace and certainty are not the same thing. April 4, 2026, 6:35 in the evening. Pad 39B at Kennedy Space Center, the same launch pad that sent Apollo astronauts to the moon, the same pad that watched Columbia lift off on her final flight. The Space Launch System rocket ignites. 8 million pounds of thrust. 4 astronauts strapped into a capsule named Integrity: Reed Wiseman, Victor Glover, Christina Koch, Jeremy Hansen. 3 Americans, 1 Canadian. 53 years since any human being has left low Earth orbit. The rocket works, the spacecraft works. The trans-lunar injection burn, 6 minutes of Orion's main engine pushing them out of Earth's gravity well, works perfectly. For the next several days, they test everything: life support, navigation, manual piloting. They eat rehydrated macaroni and cheese from pouches and watch Earth shrink behind them. On April 6th, they fly around the far side of the moon. They set a new record: 252,760 miles from Earth, farther than any human has ever traveled, surpassing Apollo 13 by over 4,000 miles. They witness a solar eclipse from behind the moon. Victor Glover will later call it the most beautiful thing he has ever seen. They name a crater after Wiseman's late wife, Carol. In a moment that makes the entire crew cry on live television, they float in silence while Mission Control says nothing for 45 seconds. Christina Koch, who already holds the record for the longest continuous spaceflight by a woman, describes the far side of the moon as something that defies every simulation they studied for years. And Jeremy Hansen, the Canadian colonel who just became the first non-American to fly beyond low Earth orbit, uses the distance record to issue a challenge. "We choose this moment," he says, voice cracking, "to challenge this generation and the next, to make sure this record is not long-lived." They spend a week and a half testing every system on a spacecraft that has never carried people before. Orion performs beautifully. None of that matters if they cannot get home. April 10th, 2026. Evening. The crew of Artemis II is falling. At 7:33 p.m. Eastern, the crew module separates from the European-built service module. The service module, which has powered Orion for the entire journey, will burn up over the Pacific. It is no longer needed. Orion is alone. An 18-second burn from the capsule's thrusters aligns the heat shield with the planet below. Everything that matters now is geometry. The angle of attack must be precise, too steep, and the capsule decelerates so violently that the crew could black out, or worse. Too shallow, and Orion skips off the atmosphere like a rock off a lake, sailing back into the void with no way to return. At 7:53 p.m. Eastern, Orion crosses 400,000 feet. Entry interface. The capsule is traveling at nearly 35 times the speed of sound, 24,661 miles per hour. 130 miles per hour short of the all-time record set by Apollo 10 in 1969. The atmosphere, thin as a whisper at that altitude, begins to bite. Within seconds, the air molecules piling up against the heat shield compress and superheat into plasma. The capsule vanishes inside a sheath of ionized gas glowing at nearly 5,000 degrees Fahrenheit, half the temperature of the surface of the sun. Through the windows, the crew watches the world turn to fire. If you have ever seen re-entry footage, you know what this looks like from the outside. A streak of white and orange light arcing across the sky like a slow-motion meteor. From the inside, it looks like the windows are melting. 1 minute and 22 seconds after entry interface, the shield hits peak heating. This is the moment. The Avcoat is supposed to be charring evenly, shedding heat layer by layer, its gases venting outward through a permeable outer crust. If it isn't, if the char layer is sealing, if pressure pockets are forming the way they did on Artemis 1, there is absolutely nothing the crew can do. There is no escape system during re-entry, no abort, no eject button, no backup shield. NASA builds redundancy into nearly everything it flies, not the heat shield. It either works or it doesn't, and the crew cannot even tell Mission Control what they are seeing. The plasma surrounding the capsule is not just hot, it is electrically charged, and it blocks radio signals the same way a wall of static drowns out a conversation. Communications go dead. A planned blackout, yes, expected, accounted for in every simulation. That does not make it less terrifying when it is happening to you. For 6 minutes, Reed Wiseman, Victor Glover, Christina Koch, and Jeremy Hansen are the loneliest people in the solar system, falling through fire at 4 times the force of gravity, with no one on the ground able to hear them, see their telemetry, or help them if something goes wrong. In Houston, flight director Jeff Radigan and his team sit in silence. Radigan had described it beforehand with the kind of understatement that astronauts and flight controllers specialize in. We'll just be thinking through things, he said, to keep ourselves calm as we wait for reacquisition of signal. Think about what that means. A room full of the most capable aerospace engineers on the planet. People who have spent years training for this exact moment, staring at screens that show nothing, listening to speakers that play nothing, knowing that 4 of their colleagues are inside a burning capsule with a known defective shield, and that the next voice they hear will either confirm that everything worked or that it didn't. There is no third option. 6 minutes of that. On board Orion, the crew feels 3.9 Gs during peak deceleration, nearly 4 times their body weight pressing them into their seats. Breathing becomes deliberate at that level. You have to consciously squeeze air into your lungs against the force trying to flatten your chest. Your vision narrows. Your arms weigh 40 pounds each. If something goes wrong with the capsule's orientation, if it starts tumbling, you physically cannot reach the controls. The capsule itself is shaking. Not gently. The entire vehicle is vibrating as superheated air batters it from every direction. Through the windows, if you can turn your head far enough to look, you see nothing but orange and white plasma. No stars, no earth, no sky, just fire. Retired astronaut Butch Wilmore, who has experienced re-entry on previous missions, once described the blackout as the loneliest feeling in spaceflight. "You know the blackout's coming," he said, "but knowing doesn't help. You are still inside a burning machine with no radio and no options, counting the seconds until the plasma clears and the signal comes back. Then, just before 8 p.m. Eastern Time, a voice crackles through the static. 'Houston, integrity! We have you loud and clear.' Reed Wiseman, calm, steady, as if he just walked in from checking the mail. The shield held. The modified trajectory worked. The continuous heating kept the avcoat permeable. The gases vented. The char layer eroded the way it was supposed to, slowly, predictably, without cracking, without fracturing, without blowing chunks of itself into the hypersonic slipstream. 2.5 years of engineering analysis, over 100 tests across the country. The bet paid off. Camarda's 1 in 20 scenario did not materialize. What follows happens fast. At 22,000 feet, 2 drogue parachutes deploy, yanking Orion's speed from thousands of miles per hour down to about 307. A minute later, at 6,000 feet, 3 massive main parachutes billow open, each one the size of a football field, hauling the capsule down to a gentle 17 miles per hour. At 8:07 p.m. Eastern, Orion hits the Pacific Ocean off the coast of San Diego. Bullseye. NASA's commentator calls it a perfect descent. The entire re-entry, from entry interface to splashdown, lasts 13 minutes. The blackout is 6 of those. The peak heating phase, the 4 minutes when the shield was under maximum stress and the crew was completely alone, is what the mission will be remembered for long after the engineering reports are archived and the press conferences are forgotten. Because the thing nobody talks about enough is what those 4 people carried into that capsule with them. Not just the flight data, not just the checklists and the procedures rehearsed 1,000 times. They carried something heavier than all of that. Reed Wiseman carried 2 daughters who had already lost their mother. Before launch, he posted a selfie with Katie and Ellie. "I love these 2 ladies," he wrote, "and I'm boarding that rocket a very proud father." 6 years earlier, his wife Carol had been diagnosed with cancer. She told him not to quit NASA, not to move the family closer to relatives back east. "This is where you work," she said. "You love your job. We should not give that up for this." She died in May 2020. 46 years old, he raised the girls alone, trained for the most dangerous mission in a generation, and then sat inside a burning capsule with no way to call home for 6 minutes, knowing that if the math was wrong, those girls would lose their remaining parent too. 4 days earlier, floating 252,000 miles from Earth, the crew had looked through Orion's windows at craters no human eyes had ever seen. Jeremy Hansen, voice cracking, told Houston that the crew wanted to name one of them Carol. "A bright spot on the moon," he called it, visible from Earth at certain times of the lunar cycle. The crew wrapped their arms around each other and floated in silence. Victor Glover, the first black astronaut to fly beyond low Earth orbit, called the solar eclipse they witnessed from behind the moon one of the greatest gifts of the mission. Christina Koch described the far side as something that defied every simulation they had studied for years. And Hansen, The Canadian fighter pilot who just became the first non-American to fly beyond low Earth orbit used the distance record to issue a challenge to the next generation. They came back through fire with a heat shield that everyone agreed was imperfect. Some called it safe enough. Some called it reckless. The crew called their spacecraft Integrity, and flew it anyway. When the parachutes opened and the capsule drifted toward the Pacific under 3 enormous canopies, the ISS crew watched from orbit. Astronaut Jessica Meir shared a photograph of the re-entry trail streaking across the atmosphere below them. Recovery teams from the USS John P. Murtha pulled alongside the bobbing capsule in inflatable boats. Ocean currents slowed the setup of the inflatable raft they call the front porch, the platform that would serve as a bridge between the capsule and the helicopters waiting to carry the crew to the ship. Divers entered the capsule to check on the astronauts and run initial medical evaluations. All 4 were in good shape. The undersea medical officer confirmed it. One by one, the astronauts climbed out of the hatch they had last used 10 days and nearly 700,000 miles ago. Wiseman came out last, stepped onto the raft, looked up at a sky he had been falling through minutes earlier. Nikki Fox, NASA's Associate Administrator for Science, called the re-entry picture perfect. The commentator Rob Navius, who has been narrating NASA missions for decades, finally let it go. "This is a perfect descent for Integrity," he said, its crew sounding hale and hearty on board. NASA will inspect the Artemis II heat shield in the coming weeks. They will compare the char patterns to their models, measure the erosion, determine whether the modified trajectory performed as predicted or whether they got lucky. For Artemis III, a redesigned shield with better permeability is already in production. The bet NASA made on Artemis II will not need to be made again. 13 minutes from atmosphere to ocean, 6 minutes of silence, 4 minutes of maximum heating where everything had to hold. And it did. 4 astronauts climbed into a capsule with a known flaw, trusted the engineers who said they understood it, and rode a controlled fireball to the surface of the Pacific Ocean at nearly 5 times the speed of a rifle bullet. We sent them to the moon because we could. We brought them home because the shield held. And somewhere on the near side of the lunar surface, there is a bright little crater that doesn't have an official name yet. The crew calls it Carroll. If you know where to look, you can see it from your backyard during certain phases of the lunar cycle. A small bright spot on the boundary between the side of the moon we know and the side we are only beginning to explore. That feels about right. Because that's what this mission was, a bright spot on the edge of the unknown. A moment when human beings looked at a problem that everyone said was unsolvable, a broken heat shield, a ticking clock, a choice between delay and danger, and decided to trust the math, trust the engineers, trust each other, and then fall through fire anyway. The Artemis II crew is home now, walking on solid ground, breathing unfiltered air, hugging their children and their spouses and their friends. But somewhere in the archives of Johnson Space Center, there is a heat shield with over 100 cracks in it. And somewhere in the engineering logs of 2024, there is a root cause analysis that says insufficient permeability. And somewhere in the heart of every engineer who made that call, there is a memory of 6 minutes of silence, waiting for a voice that might never come. It came. Integrity held. And for the first time in 53 years, human beings have flown beyond the moon and returned. Not because the hardware was perfect, because the people who built it refused to give up until they understood what went wrong. That is the difference between a disaster and a legacy. That is why we go. Thanks for watching. I'll see you in the next one.